What is happening? AJ Game Dude here, and big budget games are not selling. And so as a result, according to Epic CEO Tim Sweeney, the games industry is going to be going through a generational change, or rather that it is currently undergoing one as we speak. And I thought that this was a very interesting topic to talk about, because this is very much everything is up in the air, let's get crazy conspiratorial level of explanation and trying to put dots to bits and pieces of evidence of things that we currently know are happening in the industry. So let's talk about what these generational changes are and what this could probably mean, at least from Tim Sweeney's perspective. That being said, however, before I go into the details, just wanted to say, hey, if you like my videos, please like them and subscribe to the channel. Doing that just sends YouTube a positive message to say, hey, I like the content. Please recommend it to other people who also like similar things. So that will certainly be appreciated. But also, I'm now starting to upload my videos also to Spotify. I don't know how that looks like, but if you prefer an audio specific platform, then absolutely, I will link that also in the description below. And I do also have my Patreon link if you want to toss a buck my way. But with all of that being said, let's talk about the games industry and how big games are not selling. So, Epic CEO Tim Sweeney said in his address at Unreal Fest that there is still uncertainty about what exactly the metaverse is. I'm still surprised people haven't given up on that, but sure, I guess. The continuing growth of Fortnite and the failure of a number of high-profile big-budget games to meet expectation is proof that it represents the future of gaming somehow. Okay, so they've hit 110 million active users, which, Jesus Christ, that's a lot of kids. One of the manifestations of the change that we're seeing right now is that a lot of games are released with high budgets and they're not selling as well as expected, Sweeney said. Whereas other games are going incredibly strong, what we're seeing is a real trend where gamers are gravitating towards the real big games where they can play with more of their friends. The perceived value of a game, he continued, grows in proportion to the number of friends you can connect to, for everything from playing games together to chatting by voice, watching virtual concerts, or doing other cool virtual things online. Okay, I can't really agree with that too much, but I'll get into that in a moment. Some people will call it the metaverse, Sweeney said, and we're not at all in agreement on what this means. Some people, when they hear the word metaverse, think of what Facebook is doing with VR and now AR. Some people use the metaverse to describe everything they don't like about the current Fortnite season. So, let's just actually wind back a little bit. So, of the things that he says, pretty much the idea of doing more things with more people. I disagree with that as just someone who primarily plays single player games. I feel like that's just kind of like an easy way of describing how I kind of just disagree with a lot of what he said. Because again, why on earth would you want to watch a virtual concert when you can go out and go to a real concert? But then again, people are lazy, so I guess there's that aspect to it. But also, I think it's quite easy to say that because Fortnite is specifically geared and aimed at kids, that things like Roblox are so absolutely massive because it has a majority child audience. I kind of don't see why, Fortnite couldn't also be like that in a similar way, now that they've been able to supplant themselves after the release of Battle Royale in, I want to say 2018. So they were earlier on the boat, which is, I suppose, good for them ultimately. But then that also goes to talk about big budget standalone titles not doing particularly well from a financial point of view. Suicide Squad, let's be real, nobody wanted a Batman game to be a live service. So the fact that they had Suicide Squad actually be a live service was probably the first thing that people probably didn't want from their Batman games. Final Fantasy 16. Now this one is a surprising one. A lot of news is going around that, or at least from the perspective of Japanese industry analysts whose name I cannot remember off the top of my head, was actually saying that, hey, with Final Fantasy 16, Final Fantasy is kind of in an identity crisis where it tries to be somewhat like the earlier games were all just sort of turn-based RPGs from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, And then even going into the PS1 games where you have sort of ATB gauges with 7, 8, and 9 to some extent. And then, 10 is still turn-based. 11 is an MMO. 12 I haven't played. 13 with the paradigm system being more action-oriented. 14 being an MMO. 15 being probably the more action-oriented type of Final Fantasy that we've seen thus far. Not being able to control your party, that was kind of a bit of a downside, among other things. And of course, you couldn't do that with 13 either. And then 16 being pure action, controlling a single character the entire time and not having any party. Well, you did have a party somewhat, but you can't control them. You can only kind of direct what the general strategy is going to be. And it definitely feels more like a Devil May Cry style of game, albeit that it just doesn't quite have that level of difficulty. There are some RPG elements, but it just doesn't seem all that prevalent. And so people don't know what to expect from a Final Fantasy game anymore, because it's swaying between the action-oriented elements and the RPG elements. And what was mentioned was that more people who are buying Final Fantasy games are people who were either into Final Fantasy from the beginning and continue to be in that fandom, or they are they're playing Final Fantasy 14, which is probably the most Final Fantasy a game can actually be. Granted, it is an MMO, but the vibe surrounding the entire game, locations, story, characters, the way it handles its RPG elements, the fact that it lacks action-oriented elements, it does actually feel very reminiscent of early Final Fantasy games, especially since there are locations, characters, music, and stuff like that from early Final Fantasy games that appear in Final Fantasy 14. And people just love it. Like, that makes sense. But also Final Fantasy 14 does kind of lead into a little bit of what was being said with Sweeney, especially Tim Sweeney, especially when he was talking about being able to play more games with more people. While I personally prefer playing by myself, Final Fantasy 14 does kind of lend itself more towards what Fortnite is doing, albeit that it's just not aimed completely at a child audience in its entirety, since it does require a subscription to kind of not only to purchase the game, but also to play it. Starfield was just not a particularly good game, and a lot of people do think that it's just generally rubbish compared to its older titles or rather older Bethesda titles like Skyrim, like Oblivion, like, you could go back to like Fallout 3, for example. People prefer those games over Starfield, so it might be just yearning for more of what we already know and love, and the fact that like whatever was new didn't really hit the audience as well as Bethesda kind of hoped. And Star Wars Outlaws could go down in so many different ways, but that's just kind of part of Ubisoft's downfall during the past 10 years that has constantly been happening, for the better part of it at least. So I think it's easy to say that, hey, even though people were saying, hey, this whole thing about gaming needs to more so lean into known IPs and things like that, that doesn't seem to be working particularly well. Because known and established IP, yes, has a built-in audience already, and that new IP needs to build, audiences from the beginning by trying to sell people on something, and with known IP, that audience is built in. So, with that being said, just because there's a built-in audience, that doesn't mean the audience is going to follow everything that they know and see, especially when you look at something like Star Wars, which has been through an extremely rough patch for the past 5 or so years, where there's been an incredible amount of inconsistency across the various titles that we've seen. So this is really just a thought experiment on if known brands aren't really selling as well as people would like them to, if new ideas are too risky to be able to do anything about, then is it possible that the gaming industry is purely going to go down the path of remakes and remasters? We've had an entire era of games where we just got, remasters, re-releases, and whatever have you, and we didn't get that many original ideas about 10 years ago, especially when we look at games like Grim Fandango getting remastered. Then we had stuff like, on the PlayStation side, we had Loco Roco remastered, we had Parappa the Rapper. But then we did get at least some cool ideas in games like Drive Club and stuff like that. However, again, that didn't do particularly well. So I guess the question just becomes like, what makes a quality game? What are people looking for? Where is the general populace now? And I feel like when you look at the bare numbers of it, it seems like things like gacha games are very much taking center stage, especially when you look at Hoyo versus titles, when you look at Genshin Impact, when you look at Zenless Zone Zero and Honkai Star Rail. And of course, I mean, they've been at this for a while, especially with Honkai Impact Third. They're kind of, one of the biggest companies in the gaming space at the moment that make games themselves rather than companies like Tencent, which purchase shares of multiple gaming companies and hide it under them. And so this is very much an idea of also the economic aspect of everything that's going on, which is that everything is getting way more expensive, prices for everything is going up, and the fact that there was quite literally, I don't think, any reason to increase new generation games or current gen games from 60 USD and increase it to 70 USD, because games have not gotten all that much better. Games have not been as content rich as people would like. The quality isn't quite there, and on top of that, there are now more microtransactions, battle passes, and season passes more than ever. In fact, the whole idea of the Goldilocks effect that Ubisoft has been doing with having their normal edition of their game, the silver edition, and then the gold edition, and then pricing things in a way where gold edition is obviously way too expensive for everyone involved, and the silver edition being slightly seemingly like a good idea, and then the normal version just being like, oh, we exist, the game is here, and then also even on top of that, hell, the idea of selling early access for an extra 15 to 20 bucks of a game's price point, which has never been worth it, because especially when you consider that most gamers probably have an absolutely massive backlog, you're better off trying to kill off games from your backlog than you are trying to actually play through whatever the new thing is at the time of its release. That just doesn't work, man. I mean, I'm just saying, but from my perspective, that's just kind of where my head's at, and I don't know if anyone else kind of agrees with me, but there has been a lot of transitional aspects that have been going on with the gaming industry, especially during the last 5 to 10 years. This might be just me rambling on and on about, what's going on in the gaming space, but I feel like we've already passed multiple points where we cannot go back to the way we once were. Microtransactions are now too fully infested within games. Patch culture is become significantly more prevalent, so people are now releasing lesser games at launch and then adding more content later on down the line. Granted, some games are doing it extremely well, like with Hoyoverse games, and some games are doing it extremely poorly, and my main example for this is usually something like Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 5, for example. Do we get a lot of those examples? Sure, but that doesn't mean that a game should be released broken, though. Because back in the day, during the PS2 era, for example, if a game were to be broken, all of the discs would have to be recalled, and that would require way too much effort in order to actually do, and that would be very, very costly as well. So, even though I use the PS2 era as an example, I'm going back and playing PS2 games, PS3 games, sometimes even PS1 games. I actually booted up Crash Bash recently and had a bit of a fun time with it. Hell, the game I'm playing on my PS4 was originally a game on the PS1. I'm playing through the Crash Insane trilogy. Those are originally PS1 games. So I don't know why modern gaming is just not as good as it once was. And we could point to so many different reasons, but I feel like it's 100 problems that are causing an entire societal shift in the gaming space, and it doesn't look like it's going in the right direction. But that's just my thoughts around the whole thing. Let me know what you guys think about all of this in the comments below. Like the video if you liked it. Subscribe to the channel. I'm aiming for 300 subs by the end of the year. I do have a link to my Patreon, so if you want to toss a buck my way, you can absolutely do that. Again, channel completely unmonetized at the moment. And also, I do have a link to my Spotify as well, which is what I'll also be uploading to moving forward, so I'm not going to really be able to take those older videos and move them on as well. But with all that being said, let me know what you guys think about all of this. With all that being said and done, I do upload every day, so I'll see you guys tomorrow.